Hello and welcome. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. 2024 marks arguably the most important year for democracy in the world in our lifetimes. There will be elections where 50% of humanity will be voting, representing more than 60% of global GDP, and some 70 countries. At a time when VDem and Freedom House are both tracking the upward trajectory of authoritarianism and the downward trajectory of democracy and democratic rights, how we navigate this period and how we navigate this election in the United States has generational consequences. In that spirit, I want to commend Matt Koenig and Dan Negrea for a significant contribution to the debate over the future of America's role in the world, which ultimately will grow out of the strength of our democracy and the strength of our system and how we define ourselves. So, read it. If you don't read it, buy it. And give copies to your friends. I can't say I've read it all. I've skimmed through it, and I've read quite a bit of it already, and it's a very intelligently argued treatise. I only have a problem with the title. But I don't have a problem. I have a problem explaining it to other people, so I'm going to explain it to you as well. We win, they lose. We win, they lose. Republican foreign policy, new Cold War. So let me take the we win, they lose part. In January 1977, 4 years prior to becoming president, President Reagan bluntly stated in a conversation with Richard V. Allen, I think I have this right, his basic expectation in relation to the Cold War. Quote, "My idea of American policy toward the Soviet Union is simple, and some would say simplistic," he said. It is this: we win and they lose. So it's the good guys win, the bad guys lose. I get it. Some have interpreted this as Republicans win, Democrats lose, America wins, everybody else loses. This is not what this title says. This title says good guys win, bad guys should lose. So I embrace that. And then I've also stumbled over Republican foreign policy. So the Atlantic Council is nonpartisan. Sometimes we're bipartisan. Sometimes, you know, if there's an independent party, we can be tripartisan. But we believe there should be an American foreign policy, not a Republican foreign policy, not a Democratic foreign policy. And for most of the Cold War, it was thus. But we're not there yet. And I actually think if this fusion of Trumpism and Reaganism can be pulled off, and I can't wait to hear the debate, because Morgan, you're going to have, it's wonderful to see Morgan Ortega's here, one of my favorite people. But this debate, I think, is a central debate for the future. Because for me, Reaganism is engagement in the world. It's not isolationism. It's positive, it's sunny, it's forward-looking. So I am now at peace with the entire title of the book. Let me just say something else before I pass on. In the spirit of what I just said, and I know we're going to hear from Congressman Gallagher in a minute, right after me, but I want to quote something he said about the book because I think it captures, it's enough that I said it, no, but with Gallagher saying very much what I'm saying about an American foreign policy, let me quote him. Matthew Koenig and Dan Negrea, two of our nation's sharpest foreign policy minds, not only compellingly connect these threats, he's talking about the threats of the axis of authority and powers arrayed against the free world, not only connect these threats, but articulate a strategic framework for confronting them that can unite all Americans. And to me, I was very pleased to see that because I think that's where ultimately we hope to land, where how we approach the world in our foreign policy can be consistent irrespective of what party, relatively consistent, in the basic tenets consistent. What the authors hope for is a Trump-Reagan fusion. I'll look forward to the debate on this concept. I think this is a time for big debates and big ideas and large thinking. It is the beginning of a new era. We are on the cusp of the new era, and we have the potential to shape it if we have the political will and if we have the unity of purpose. So I'm very grateful for all of our speakers for joining us today. Others will introduce the other speakers, but I want to close with a special thanks to Congressman Mike Gallagher for delivering virtual remarks to kick us off. He represents Wisconsin's 8th District. He's done so since 2017 and serves as the chairman of the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. So thank you all for joining us, and let me turn over now to Congressman Gallagher.
They say one's greatest role models are usually in the family, and the Koenig family provides two excellent models. You have Brad, who's not at the event today, but clearly got the looks in the Koenig family and is an actual model. But my friend Matt is here to present a model of his own for how we can win the new Cold War. His author, Dan Negrea, came to the Atlantic Council from policy planning at the State Department, where George Kennan, Wisconsinite, I remind you, worked. And for Dan, this was a chance to give back to his adopted country after a career behind the Iron Curtain and then on Wall Street. And in their new book, the two, with two just incredible backgrounds, have provided a strategy to win our new Cold War with the CCP and synthesized the Reagan and the Trump schools of Republican foreign policy into a new fusionist approach that can unite a fractured party around unifying principles. When did this new Cold War begin? Academics continue to debate when the old Cold War began. Did it begin when Orwell first used the phrase? Did it begin when the Soviets tested the nuclear weapon in 1949? Did it begin with the Korean War when it turned hot in 1950? Who knows? But academics will continue to debate in the future when the new Cold War with Communist China began, but there's no debate that the CCP has been waging Cold War against America for over a decade, since at least 2009, which predates Xi Jinping's rise to power. The longer we deny the existence of this new Cold War, the longer we allow the CCP to advance their totalitarian anti-American agenda under the cover of win-win cooperation. And I think Matt and Dan deserve a lot of credit for just recognizing the reality and nature of the competition we're in. Because the CCP's history and ideology, even among communist regimes, make it an aggressive, paranoid regime that is laser focused on destroying our global position. She believes that the Soviet Union fell because its leaders did not understand they were engaged in an ideological war against capitalist democracy. And he will do anything he can to prevent the Chinese Communist Party from facing the same fate as Communist Russia. This is not a regime that's going to be content making a grand bargain or even with a stable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific or globally. So even if we wanted that to happen, I don't think it'd be feasible in the short term. The title of Dan and Matt's book also echoes Ronald Reagan's simple model in 1977 for how you end a Cold War. We win and they lose. And many of their proposals for dealing with the CCP today echo Reagan's strategy for victory over the Soviets, as outlined in NSDD 75, where, and here I quote Reagan's team, U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union will consist of three elements: external resistance to Soviet imperialism, internal pressure on the USSR to weaken the sources of Soviet imperialism, and negotiations to eliminate, on the basis of strict reciprocity, outstanding disagreements. Reagan, Kennan, and other Cold Warriors understood that it would end not necessarily through negotiations or military force, but when the Soviet Union was transformed internally to remove the causes of the conflict. And if you read Dan and Matt's book, I think this is the closest we've come to actually having a meaningful debate about what the long-term goal of U.S. strategy should be. There is consensus on the near-term goal, which is deterring a war over Taiwan. And I would even say in the midterm, there's an emerging consensus that we should control the commanding heights of critical technology. But there's been a dearth of debate on what our long-term goal looks like. And Matt and Dan really tease out what victory in the new Cold War looks like. And they say it comes when the Chinese government no longer has the will or the capacity to threaten core United States interests. This might mean the CCP mellowing over time, or a new generation of Chinese leaders deciding that Xi's approach failed and having concluded that challenging the United States and its allies is simply too costly, or opting for a more cooperative path The CCP might even collapse, as the Soviet Union did, leaving a less threatening autocratic regime or even a peaceful liberal democracy. But to get there, our policy, like Reagan's, must feature an ideological thrust that makes clear the supremacy of our values. And at the same time, what the Trump administration brought was an understanding that our national strength lay not only in force of arms or in our values, but in the strength of the American economy. From the degradation of the American industrial base, from IP theft to currency manipulation, countering CCP economic aggression is just as central to protecting our national security interests as deterring the PRC in the Taiwan Strait. That's what makes this new Cold War far more difficult and complex than the old, because we never had to contemplate selective decoupling from the Soviet Union because our economies didn't really interact, whereas we are conjoined twins with China economically in the new Cold War. And in their book, Matt and Dan call for this foreign policy Reagan-Trump fusion. It combines that aggressive economic rebalance that will bring jobs back to America while reducing the CCP sources of leverage with a diplomatic approach that includes clear red lines for Chinese behavior and is grounded in peace through strength. Both Trump and Reagan rejected a reliance on norms or mutually assured destruction in favor of a military buildup that aims to put hard power in the path of our adversaries. American nuclear weapons did not stop Mao from sending troops into Korea, Brezhnev into Afghanistan, or Putin into Ukraine. We have no reason to think that we'll stop Xi's landing craft from crossing the Taiwan Strait. We need to restore our conventional deterrent in particular. I'm also reminded in reading Matt and Dan's book of that famous moment when Ronald Reagan traveled to Moscow in 1988, and he spoke at Moscow State University, where his goal was less diplomacy than it was addressing the Russian people directly at Moscow State, which is where Gorbachev went to school. He made the case, standing under the bust of Lenin, I believe, he made the case for freedom everywhere. And I think he gave us a model for how you do ideological warfare intelligently, smartly, and how candor and truth, far from being provocative, can actually be a core part of a deterrent strategy and a stabilizing factor. And I think when American leaders speak about the United States and China relations, or even two leaders of the CCP themselves, they should use it not as a moment to kowtow to our nation's foremost adversary or take the temperature down, but to speak truths to the Chinese people, truths that the CCP does not want them to hear. As Dan and Matt observe in their book, domestic political stability is an autocrat's Achilles heel. And the U.S. government should identify what the CCP considers the pillars of its regime stability and put them at risk. For example, they suggest that U.S. Cyber Command should make it a daily mission to bring down the Great Firewall and provide access to information to the Chinese people. This is a critical point that is often ignored because it's difficult. People don't even want to talk about it because it's considered provocative. But there's a point at which the fear of provocation becomes provocative itself because it signals weakness. And I would submit that if we want to set ourselves on a path to victory, we have to first define what victory looks like. And Dan and Matt have done exactly that. And in the process, they've done the nation a lasting service. I hope my colleagues in Washington, and in fact, all Americans, read this book and take up the cause of waging and winning the new Cold War. And I'll end with a thought. I often get criticized for using that term, new Cold War. And I have to remind people that there are things that are worse than Cold War. One of those things is hot war. And a hot war with China would be absolutely horrific. It's even hard to wrap our minds around it. Even those of us who fought the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq struggle to comprehend what a great power war would look like. I would also submit that surrender of American global leadership, a slow surrender of the order that we've built up painstakingly since the last time we fought a great power conflict would be worse than waging Cold War. And deterrence may be difficult, but war is hell and surrender is unacceptable. So thank you to Matt and Dan for their critical work, for outlining, for giving us a sense of what victory looks like, and then identifying a path for how we achieve that victory. I look forward to engaging in the debate that I'm sure this book will provoke, and it's a debate that we need to be having in Washington, D.C., and I'm honored that I could join you, albeit virtually today, and I look forward to seeing you all in person.
Well, thanks to everybody who are here in person and all of you watching online. I'm Morgan Ortegas, the moderator of this event. I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists, and then we're going to get right into the debate. We're going to take audience questions as well. We may even have some questions online. So I'm not going to be long on the bios, but you've heard our authors reference Dr. Matt Kronig, Vice President and Senior Director here at the Atlantic Council. Also, I thought this was interesting. I thought I was one of the only people who could say this, but you have served in the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations at various levels. We also have Dan Negrea, who's a senior director here at the Atlantic Council. He worked in policy planning at the State Department, but much more interestingly, he defected from communist Romania and is now a great American. And so we're thrilled to have you. Next to me here in person, we have Ms. Elizabeth Braw. She is a senior fellow here at the Transatlantic Security Initiative, where she focuses on gray zone and hybrid threats here at the Atlantic Council, an expert on Europe, an expert on the intersection of geopolitics and the economy. Excited to have your take, especially the European perspective. And virtually, we have Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley. Her resume is way too long. We could take the whole hour talking about all of her achievements. She's a 30-year diplomat, former U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Malta, and she's a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council and has served all over the world. And most impressively, I like this about her bio, she has the Department of State Meritorious and Superior Honor Awards for acts of courage during an al-Qaeda attack on the U.S. consulate in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia in 2004. So thank you, Ambassador. Good for you. Okay, I think we should jump right in. First of all, you can tell I host a Sunday radio show, which, by the way, is on Sirius XM, Patriot Channel 125, 11 to 1 every Sunday, the Morgan Ortegas Show. So we have to talk about the book. Where do you get the book? Before we get into everything, everyone's here watching, listening. How do you buy it?
It's available on Amazon, and it's the #1 new release in international relations currently. So some people are buying it already, but encourage everybody to go out and get their copy on Amazon.
Amazon, that's easy. My husband would say I don't get nearly enough Amazon packages, so now I'll have a new one. Awesome, thank you. Well, I think that's incredibly important. So let's jump right in. I'm really interested in what Fred Kemp was talking about, which is the intersection, or what it may be, the intersection of Trump, Reagan, foreign policy. Can you sort of tell us what exactly that means? What are the similarities and what are the differences?
Well, the idea for the central argument of the book came at a retreat of Republican foreign policy experts, and you had kind of never-Trumpers, people who had served in past Republican administrations, Trump administration officials, and there was a lot of agreement, a few heated debates, but a lot of agreement. And a prominent U.S. senator said, what we really need is a Trump-Reagan fusion. And I thought that was an interesting idea. What would a Trump-Reagan fusion look like? And so that's what Dan and I try to articulate in the book. And I think there's this conventional wisdom that the party is very much divided between kind of the Trumpian wing and a Reaganite wing. And actually, in doing the research in the book, Dan and I came to the conclusion that the party is more united than many people think. Yes, on aid to Ukraine or other issues, there are big fights. But when it comes to just kind of basic worldview, I think there is a conservative worldview that's different from a progressive worldview that brings them together. And then we go through and talk about peace through strength and defense policy, free and fair trade and economic policy, American exceptionalism. It's kind of major pillars. But then China, Iran, North Korea, border, immigration, climate. I think these are all issues where both the kind of Trumpian and Reaganite wings of the party really do agree, and that's what we try to articulate in this book.
Well, it often seems like we're having such a family food fight in the Republican Party as it relates to our foreign policy. So I'm glad that you have found areas of commonality, which is what you do here at the Atlantic Council. Dan, you and I worked together in the Trump administration at the State Department. I had the very fun job of explaining to the world what an America First foreign policy actually meant. So that was a great job on a daily basis. But I joke. But in a potential Trump term two, Fred was just talking about this. We have an election. It's very close. No one knows which way it's going to go. How would a Trump second term, from a foreign policy perspective, how do you think that would differ from what we did, for example, at Mike Pompeo's State Department in the first term?
Well, first of all, delighted to see you here. You are such a star at the State Department, and I see you on Fox and so on and so forth. So delighted that you agreed to do this. I think we already know some of the priorities that President Trump, former President Trump, is outlining for his second term. And they're driven by what the voters are saying the priorities are. So, for example, if you look at exit polls at different primary scrutinies, immigration is a big issue. So in the book, we argue that immigration in the United States, unregulated, in an open southern border, is a national security risk in a variety of ways. For example, we don't know who these people are. I mean, there are something like 8 million people who have entered the United States illegally because they're not going through normal channels. But in addition to this, there are the so-called 1.5 million of known gotaways, meaning people who don't come to the border agents, but the border agents see them crossing the border. Now, the border agents right now are very friendly, so the people who are not talking to them have something to hide, have a nefarious reason. And then there are the not known gotaways, which are estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands. In our book, on the first page, in the subtitle, we say that we are in the new Cold War. If we accept the premise that we are in a new Cold War, this implies a seriousness of purpose on what our policy should be, and sort of the basic thing that we have to do is to have a secure border. We also identify a new axis of evil led by the Chinese Communist Party, the dictatorial power in Communist China. Well, there are 35,000 Chinese citizens who entered the United States just last year, 21,000 just since October. Knowing how there are laws in China that people have to collaborate with the Secret Service there, it's a reasonable assumption that some of these people are plants. And then there is the whole discussion with TikTok and so on. So there will be priorities that are derived from the reality of what we call a new Cold War. There are also priorities that are derived from what the American people say are their priorities.
Which you think is immigration and border security?
One of them.
Yeah. Elizabeth, you know, it's no secret if you read Politico Europe that there are some heart palpitations in the continent about a second Trump presidency. We tend to spend a lot of time focusing on the 2% number of what countries are paying in NATO. I think about 18 of 31 are meeting their 2% threshold. But I think the more important metric on NATO and on Europe writ large is where will they be with the United States if there is a second Trump presidency on China. I think that is clearly has been defined by now both Trump and Biden White Houses in their national security strategies, clearly the leading threat to the United States. And there is some concern that while the United States has stood by the Europeans as it relates to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that there won't be the same solidarity if, God forbid, there is a military incursion with China over Taiwan or some other issue.
You're right about the heart palpitations, and thank you for mentioning that. There is that concern, and I think the challenge is, so if you look at businesses, they always want things to be predictable, they want things to be stable so that they can plan. But governments want predictability too, and this is, I think, what's caused a lot of heart palpitations, heartburn, all those unpleasant things in the first Trump administration. That maybe, you know, there were agreements on various issues, but there was a lack of predictability in what Trump was going to do, was planning to do. So you saw agreements among various Western governments with the U.S. when Trump tried to take on China's approach to globalization, and he did it in his own way, but yet there was agreement that something needed to be done because we all knew that the globalized economy, the way it had been set up or just established itself, wasn't really working very well. But then we got things like the tariffs on America's closest allies, and then that seemed to make no sense, in fact caused a lot of offense. And so if we look at a potential second term, I think for the sake of allied unity, it would be a good thing if whatever Trump plans and his administration plans, if that's communicated clearly, and if steps that may offend or harm allies, if they are communicated clearly and if they are explained, if it is explained why they are considered necessary. And if that's not done, then steps that may be positive will be lost in the public debate. So, for example, the additional spending, defense spending that Trump committed to Europe, that just got completely lost because people focused on the language rather than the actions. And that is extremely unfortunate, not just from I would think from an American perspective, but from an alliance perspective.
Am I hearing you right then that it's less of a policy issue and more of a communications issue?
Yeah, you need your job
Yeah,
back.
I know. Clearly, I needed to do a better job.
Well, you need to speak more.
We'll work on that.
A communications issue and also an issue of establishing a strategy and presenting it so that people know what to expect, so that they don't have to worry about waking up with heart palpitations when they read Politico the following morning.
I guess I would argue too.
Or the Times of London.
I don't speak for Secretary Pompeo anymore, but I think he would probably argue that some of that, the unknown, the unpredictability we actually used to our favor, to our advantage. But I understand how that makes the Europeans feel. I want to make sure that we get the ambassador. And Ambassador, thank you for your storied career and service to the United States. You've spent a lot of time in the Middle East and in Africa as well. And we can't have a discussion about what's happening globally without talking about the Middle East. And one of the last things that I did before I took maternity leave in the Trump administration was the Abraham Accords. And now, of course, we have had October 7th, and we have just what I think even the Biden administration would admit is it's an unsustainable relationship with Iran. We can't have U.S. troops shot at, whether it's on our ships, whether it's in Jordan. So how do you see, whether it's a second Biden administration or a Trump term too, how do you see the Middle East shaping up in 2025? And I guess what would be your advice for a second Trump term too on the Middle East if he were to be reelected?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. And I want to add that I've had the pleasure of working in the Biden administration, the Trump administration, Obama, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Reagan. So from Reagan to Trump is a really interesting pathway to be looking at or reviewing, as it were. The challenge, and it was wonderful policy and a wonderful achievement to get the Abraham Accords. I don't think you will find anyone who won't give props to that. It was one of the high achievements of the Trump administration. I think we all see at this point that there was a fundamental flaw in the thinking behind it, and that you could move forward with all of these countries and ignore the Palestinians. And that is what has tripped us all up at this point, to state it very lightly. The key, as well as the current block to expanding the Abraham Accords and really having them cemented and enriched, it goes to Palestinians, treatment in the Gaza Strip, and the day after this conflict is over. So when you think before October 7th, the only countries, according to the Israeli government, that they did not have some sort of diplomatic or other relationship with were Syria and Lebanon, including Saudi Arabia, quietly. We had $10 billion worth of investment in Israel being discussed from the United Arab Emirates. We had Morocco setting up a cyber agreement with Israel and military cooperation. The Sudanese talking about military cooperation. And of course, Bahrain has a strong incentive to keep those accords going for balance in the region and offsetting Iran's influence in the region. So we start with that really strong march out, and we get to today because they did not take the Palestinian issue into account. And people thought we could set it aside, ignore that it would truck along. We heard the Biden administration senior official, national security advisor say it's going well in the Middle East and moving on and hoping to get the Saudis involved. And of course, Hamas changed that. So if nothing else, unfortunately, doing it this way, Hamas has reminded us all that this situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians is not sustainable. And whether you are Republican or Democrat, progressive, evangelical, it doesn't matter. As human beings, we all understand, number one, this level of death and destruction is a terrible thing, and we as an international community need to see it arrested. And more so for those of us in the United States as close allies with Israel. This conflict is not good for Israelis, it's not good for Palestinians, and it's not good for the region. So with this conflict, we have seen discussions go from $10 billion of investment from the UAE and cooperation with Israel to, I think, at the beginning of last week or maybe the end of the week before, the UAE announcing that they were suspending $2 billion worth of investment with BP and with an Israeli firm. That's a terrible stumble in that relationship. It isn't that it can't be put on track again, but it's not going to be able to be put on track as long as this conflict continues in this way. Morocco had significant plans. They've had steady protests within the country. And so the Moroccan government is having to navigate between their people and their desire to maintain this relationship. So citizens have called for a break. Flights have been canceled between Morocco and Israel. But the recognition that they got for the Western Sahara is likely to keep them on track, but certainly slow it down. Bahrain has also had unprecedented demonstrations in the country. And again, they've got this balancing act. Bahrain is tiny and in the midst of some very strong neighbors, so they're used to that balancing act, and I think they'll be able to navigate it all right. The Sudan has paused on some of the cooperation that it intended to do with Israel as well. I would also say, I think the interest office, I think it is in Morocco, that has also not been set up. And certainly the next step that the Trump administration anticipated and the Biden administration certainly wants to get done is a clear establishment of relations with the Saudis, and that's not going to happen as well until we get to the day after, the ceasefire and the day after. So all of those have an impact, all of that, and then Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, this broad conflict in the region is upsetting the plans of the Biden administration. And if we have a second Trump administration without getting this ceasefire in place and finding a credible alternative to Hamas, it is going to be difficult for a Trump administration to move forward in the way that it would like to as well.
You know, we have about 7-8 minutes before I'm going to go to audience questions, and I want to stay on the Middle East, but we need to go to China. That's sort of emblematic of our foreign policy. We keep trying to go to China, but we get stuck on the Middle East. But as our friend Mike Gallagher talked about in the intro about the new Cold War, as he calls it, and you were, of course, in your book, We Win, They Lose, you're talking about the future of Republican foreign policy. What is the future of Republican foreign policy as it relates to countering the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, I think this is an area of bipartisan consensus that China is the biggest state-based threat facing the United States. And I think a concern that Dan and I had is we recognized, the Trump administration recognized great power competition as the greatest priority in the 2017 national security strategy. The Biden administration has continued that with strategic competition. But competition's not a strategy. What is the goal? What does victory look like? And so Dan and I were wrestling with that, and we thought we could do no better than Reagan's clear statement for the goal of the first Cold War: we win, they lose. And so we grappled with what does that look like, and we essentially argue that, and we haven't heard a really clear statement of this from the U.S. Government. What does success look like? But essentially we argue is getting to a place where China lacks either the ability and or the will to threaten U.S. core interests would be success. And then we lay out a bunch of different ways you could get there. But we think by pursuing a kind of dual-track strategy of deterrence and diplomacy, strengthening ourselves, working with our allies to defend ourselves from the threats China poses, pushing back where they're violating widely held international standards, but also a diplomacy track, a willingness to engage with China when they're willing to come to the table and be constructive. That over time, that could put them in a position where either they are squeezed and lack the ability to threaten us the way they do today, or that a new generation of Chinese leadership says, you know what, that didn't work. Challenging the United States and its allies is too difficult. We should try a different path.
You know, Dan, we've talked about this a little bit today, but we have this sort of newer axis of resistance, China, Russia, Iran, and you even see it playing out in the wars in the Middle East and in Europe today, right, with Iranian suicide drones, ballistic missiles, right? They're all of them. They're exchanging military hardware, technology, secrets, et cetera. How does the United States tackle that new axis of resistance?
Happy to answer the question. If I may come back to the Middle East, despite the fact that we don't want to go to the Middle East. One of the things that we make very clear in the book is that behind all the troubles in the Middle East is Iran. Iran, with its policy of causing instability, supporting terrorism in the form of Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis in Iraq, in Syria. So that's the nefarious force in the Middle East. And we need to address that the way we did in the Trump administration through extreme economic pressure so that they don't have money to support the terrorists that are causing the massacre on October 7, attacks on free shipping in the Red Sea and all these issues. But coming now back to your question, what do we do with the axis of evil? The first thing we need to do is to recognize that there is such a thing. And I think it's important then to figure out how they work together. There is no alliance. There is an alignment or an entente, as some people call it. And we need to counter them with all the tools of statecraft. In the case of Iran, North Korea, and Russia, it's mostly military. That's how they oppose us. So it is in that sphere. But in the case of China, it is very much in the economic sphere where there is all this talk about decoupling or selective decoupling or de-risking. So in the case of China, we need to use all the tools of statecraft, economic, military, ideas, which is very important, and diplomacy. And then in the case of the others, more selectively, some of these tools.
Can I add something
go
to
for
that?
it.
Which is that actually the Chinese leadership is unwittingly providing help for what you're just describing, Dan, which is that the risk of doing business in China is already increasing, and so that makes it's making it less attractive for Western companies to do business there. And that's nothing to do with what anybody has said in Washington or any other capital. It has to do with the Chinese leadership's view on free enterprise and the power that the private sector has reached in China. So that's why there is a crackdown going on, which is making it less attractive for or actually less safe for Western companies and other companies to do business there. And in fact, this is an interesting sign of our times, I think. It's almost impossible to get political risk insurance in China today. So if you have political risk insurance, great, and these run over sort of 5 to 10 to even 20 years. But if you don't have it, you need it, and you can't get it because even underwriters think it's too risky to underwrite business operations in China. So that is a sign of how businesses across the board view China. And so unwittingly, Chinese authorities, the Chinese leadership are sort of helping along this decoupling that is desired by some people. And whether we want it or not, it is happening for these combined reasons, which is extraordinary. What would be the case today if people in Washington, Republican strategists like you and maybe Democratic strategists too, were saying, well, we need less exposure to China because that's making us too vulnerable. And the Chinese government were making it as attractive as it was in the 90s, then we would have a problem. Now they are actually helping extraordinary confluence of events.
But absolutely. Just to stay on sort of our alliances, not only in Europe, but in Asia, just following up on that question you just answered, and then I'm going to get the ambassador. And before we turn it over to the audience, I was actually quite pleasantly surprised and very supportive of AUKUS whenever the deal was announced. It, of course, did cause a lot of heart palpitations for some members in Europe who are not a part of AUKUS. But is that the kind of alliance building that you would encourage a Trump term to do, or do you actually think it was counterproductive by not including more in Europe?
Well, I think the French would say was deeply unproductive and disloyal. But we have reached the point where NATO has a lot of members, as many more than anybody had ever expected. But it also makes it a slightly unwieldy alliance because everybody has to agree to whatever it is that the alliance is expected to do. So I think whether we like it or not, it's natural that we'll see more informal and even formal groupings emerge among the existing member states and even non-member states. And that's not a bad thing because NATO can't be all things to all people. It can't respond to every challenge. So we are seeing AUKUS, we are also seeing the JEF, which is completely different, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which involves Northern European countries and has nothing to do with submarine. It's sort of an expeditionary force, as it says on the tin. And so we'll see more groupings like that and more power to them. Everybody still believes in NATO, but NATO can't be everything, everywhere, all the time.
Ambassador, you've probably spent more time on the ground in the global south than anybody in this room. What is your perception of how the global south views this competition, strategic competition, global competition, whatever administration you're in wants to call it? What is your perspective of how they view this competition and where are they siding? China, United States, somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I would argue that maybe heading for China, but reluctantly, because we, in spite of all of our historic missteps and people pointing out to us that we're not standing up for our values or we're not living our values when it comes to human rights or so on and so forth, people would still rather be with us. And I would argue as a diplomat and for every administration for which I have worked, the key for the United States is not to abandon the field, not to abandon the field. That means putting money and personnel into being out there and making the case for the United States, for making sure that partners, would-be partners, allies, and others understand the benefits of aligning with us, and simply accepting, absorbing, and championing the sorts of values that we have traditionally stood for. But I would argue, and I don't know if this is Trump administration or Obama or Clinton or Bush or Biden for that matter, about the importance of not abandoning the field as Americans. I think we cannot do that.
Great. So let's jump into audience questions. I know I have some on here, but I think we're also going to, we can take them from the audience, right? Okay. You've been waiting patiently with your hand up in the back.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm happy to kick this off. I'm John Davenport from Fordham University. I see two big challenges to a new Republican foreign policy. And one of them, I'll be very quick, I think is what I call the Mearsheimer doctrine. You've probably addressed both of these, I think, in the book. The challenge there being, this is convincing, it seems, a lot of policymakers, that somehow it's the fault of democratic countries, NATO countries, that Putin has become, what he has become. As if somehow we should have just left all of Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War without the protection of NATO coverage, which to me, and I think probably many people in this room, would just be morally unimaginable, right? But the second challenge, I guess this might be, in line of bringing in John McCain's thoughts. So Trump, Reagan, but what about McCain? As was just mentioned, could it be helpful to think in a new Trump administration, perhaps, about a new alliance of some kind, given that NATO can't necessarily be this? If we had, 50 countries, let's say, that included most of NATO, most of the EU, but Britain, and our partners in Southeast Asia, and perhaps, a couple in Africa and South America, we would have an economic alliance that would be unbeatable, I think, right? That would be enough to really put the kind of pressure on China that it sounds like you want. Thanks.
Dan, go ahead.
So nice to meet you in person, Professor. We've been corresponding. So a few thoughts. So what we talk about in the book is we recognize the fact that the second invasion of Ukraine in 22 crystallized, again, the world in terms that we are recognizing from the First Cold War, a free world on the one hand, the bad guys, the new axis of evil, but then the appearance also of what we can call a new non-aligned movement. Now the question is, how do we deal with the new axis of evil? And coming back to the question that Morgan asked of the ambassador, how do we deal with the global south? A flexible constellation of partnerships, of ad hoc alliances, coalitions of the willing. There is talk, for example, of a T12, Technology 12, a number of countries that Morgan talked about, AUKUS. That's another example. There was a group of countries that were saying sort of an economic self-defense league. So when China wants to economically coerce whether Australia not buying their beef or South Korea not allowing tourists to go there or Japan not selling, then there will be countervailing sanctions or actions from those countries. But underlining all this, there is no replacement for NATO. But the NATO countries have to spend significantly more. And in an article that Matt and I wrote subsequent to the book, we argued that we have to forget about the 2%. It's time to go to 3%.
Well, I'm going to go into some of the questions here. And let me just, I think maybe Matt and Elizabeth, maybe you both might want to take this one on. Are former President Trump's recent comments on NATO indicative of what his policy will be toward the alliance should he take office, or would he have a different approach?
Well, the first thing I think he said in his recent comment is the NATO allies need to spend more, and I think he's right about that. The NATO allies agreed to all hit this 2% target. As you stated in your opening, only 18 of the 32 are expected to do that this year, so the other third need to hit that target. And then also, last year at the Vilnius summit, NATO announced these new regional plans, agreed to essentially the first serious defense plans for Europe since the end of the Cold War. The Economist magazine estimated that to actually provide the capabilities for those plans, that NATO will probably have to increase the defense spending level to something like 3%. So I do think the allies need to do more, and it's not just a matter of fairness, it's about effective global strategy. If the United States and its allies are going to take on China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, the United States can't do it on its own. The allies need to step up. And then in terms of the more inflammatory parts of his statements, I think we learned Trump's negotiating style in the first term, and I think we understood that, and I think we've forgotten those lessons. But he often starts with kind of an extreme statement, and that's not the final policy position. I think that's to begin a conversation, begin a negotiation, and to encourage his negotiating partners, in this case the NATO allies, to meet him in the middle and increase defense spending.
I'm glad 8 years later we're still having the discussion about whether we should take him literally or figuratively. We haven't learned that lesson yet. You know, one of the things I was thinking about, Elizabeth, as I listened to the ambassador speak, and I thought that her comments were so moving about America's role, especially at the Global South, and how they're reluctantly China, but there is a place for us. When I hear that, I think, well, that makes me want to get in the fight, right? However, I also think, and I don't live in DC anymore, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and I think about the moms going to the grocery store and how much it costs for them to fill up their grocery cart. I think about how much it costs, you know, a dad who's working 2 jobs because he can't make ends meet to fill up his gas tank, and people are worried about crime, people are worried about the border. So how do we as Republicans make the case that we need to care about Ukraine and Europe whenever there seems to be so much domestic turmoil?
I think, and I think there may be some former journalists, including you here in the room, Morgan, who know that in order to interest people in something, you have to help them relate to other people. It's not an abstraction, right? I mean, Ukraine is not an abstraction, it's people. So I'm not saying it would be possible to transport a lot of Ukrainians to every town in America, but that is the case you have to make, because otherwise, what is 2%? I mean, it's like a figure, and why should anybody? Why should people care about it? It sounds like a sort of a nerdy argument that is being had in various capitals among people in think tanks, and actually it matters way outside think tanks. And by the way, when it comes to what we spend that 2% on, I think if people were helped to understand that actually it's not just expenditure, it's jobs, and incidentally, the money that Germany is now spending as part of the Sondervermögen, a lot of it is going to American defense manufacturers, because that's where you can buy off-the-shelf defense manufacturing. So that's coming back to your point. I think we have to help people relate to other people, whether it be Ukrainians, whether it be defense manufacturing workers, or anybody else, to help them get that perspective on whatever the issue is of the day. Now it's Ukraine. Who knows what it will be next? Whether it could be China. And then just one more point on since you mentioned defense manufacturing earlier. I think it's extraordinary that we just assume that the people who will make the weapons will somehow turn up in the factories and make the weapons. Who are they? Where are they? So if we're going to make this sort of commitment to national security in our countries, we should also talk about the people who are supposed to make these weapons on which we spend 2%, and ask ourselves, well, would I be willing to would I have the skills to work in a defense factory? Would I encourage my children to go and work in a defense factory? And these are skilled jobs, but who is going to do them? We don't have those people now. So do something for your country. Go and work in a defense factory. Train yourself accordingly.
Ambassador, we have another question here that has been written in. What would a win-win outcome for the United States look like with respect to China? Do we still have her? Oh, I think we lost her audio. Okay.
Ambassador, can you hear us?
I think she can hear us.
Okay, we can't hear you for some reason.
Do you want to answer that while they're trying to fix her audio?
Well, I think win-win is a term that the Chinese use.
I think maybe they meant win-lose when they were writing the question. But.
Well, when China uses it, they mean China wins twice.
I'm going to steal that. That's a good line.
Yeah, so I think win-lose, as Dan and I say, is what we should be aiming for. And you know, the Biden administration has said that they just see our relationship with China as a mix of competition, cooperation, and confrontation. But competition to me sounds like a tennis match. There are agreed rules. I'm not sure there's much real competition between the United States and China. If you look at the international economic system, they're systematically cheating. Cooperation, there are areas where we'd like to cooperate. Climate change, global pandemics, arms control. But there's not much going on there. China's the biggest greenhouse gas emitter. It's preventing the WHO from conducting an effective investigation into COVID origins. It won't even talk seriously about arms control. Unfortunately, Dan and I argue in the book that we see that the statement that it's kind of three parts is really about a third right, that increasingly the relationship is defined by its most confrontational elements.
Dan, every 2 years, politicians in the United States from both parties go before their constituents and their donors, and they're giving grassroots speeches, and they say, this is the most important election of our lifetime. Fred Kemp did that for us earlier. But Fred seems to argue that it is the most important election of our lifetimes because it will have generational consequences for democracy. Do you agree with that? And if so, what are the possible outcomes?
Matt and I just had an exceptionally interesting podcast with Newt Gingrich to talk about our book. And Newt asked a similar question. And I cheated. I read his book, Trump versus China, before. So I quoted his answer to his. So you can't lose when you are doing that.
I can't hear anything.
No.
So Newt argues that China is an existential threat to the United States, comparable to the other four major threats that this republic of ours has faced in its history, starting with fighting the British, the Civil War, the Second World War. He doesn't mention the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War. So indeed, and then he argues in his book that Trump has the right approach in opposing China in a departure from the Obama policy, which was emphasizing cooperation. And as Matt said, we need to focus on the confrontation because China is confronting us. So Newt argues that this is the gravest threat that the United States has ever faced, with an adversary that is more dangerous than any other that we've ever faced. So it is an election where we need a strong leader such that we can prevail in this existential threat to the United States.
Well, I'm going to get the hook if I go past 5 o'clock. So I want to thank all of you. If you're watching online, we have the book here in person. You're missing out on signed autographs from the brother to a supermodel. Dan. Sorry,
No, that's me, right?
Oh, that's you. I'm sorry. Sorry, Dan. But the book is We Win, They Lose, Republican Foreign Policy in the New Cold War. You can get it on Amazon. And you can also listen to Matt on Sunday. He will be on the Morgan Ortega Show on Sirius XM sometime in between 11 and 1. I don't know, so you'll just have to listen to the show. So thank you so much. Thank you for letting me moderate. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Ambassador, for your service. And thank you to the Atlantic Council.